Now, here was the Marine Corps analysis. First of all, strategic lessons. Military operations alone cannot solve deep-seated political problems. Okay. Military commanders need clear policy guidance from which they could work steadily and logically. Confusion generated by missing or conflicting policy guidance is made worse by poorly defined lines of command and control. So those first two messages right there are all about clear guidance. And this happens all the time in the business world, where you don't see clear guidance making it all the way down to the front lines through the chain of command. Russian senior command lacked continuity and was plagued by too much senior leadership involvement at the lower operational level. Lack continuity. There's got to be clear message that every leader's got to be basically saying the same fundamental message. Contrary to initial expectation, operations were neither of short duration or low cost. When Russian security operations began achieving results, the Chechens started attacking targets within Russia. It was difficult to unite police and military units into a single cohesive force. Distinct tactical advantages accrue to the side with less concern for the safety of the civilian population. That is something that we absolutely dealt with in Ramadi. Again, it's that the distinct tactical advantage accrue to the side with less concern for the safety of the civilian population. This was of utmost concern to every soldier and Marine on the ground in Ramadi, was trying to protect the civilian population. And of course, the Al-Qaeda insurgents that we were facing did not care at all about the civilian population or any of their buildings or any of their lives or children or women or anything else. Concern about civilian casualties and property destruction declined as casualties among Russian forces rose. So initially, the Russians were also concerned about civilian casualties, but as they started taking casualties, it got worse and worse. Here are some operational lessons. Having well-developed military doctrine for urban warfare is not enough in and of itself. Got to have that creativity. Doctrine does not answer everything. Situation-oriented training would have improved Russian military effectiveness, and we're going to talk about that later today, but situation-oriented training. And that is when you put yourself in situations and you make people have to think. It's not about executing pre-planned moves. It's just like in martial arts. It's not about being able to do a kata and do a movement. That's not what it's about. It's about reacting to another free-thinking human being, and in this case, a group of free-thinking human beings. How do you react in those situations?
And they're in specific situations as well, right? Like those like in jiu-jitsu, we do situational training. They'll be like, okay, here, half guard. If you get on top, you start all over. If you, tap the guy or whatever, you start all over. In half guard, start all over, in half guard.
Inadequate training in the most basic maneuver and combat skills inhibited Russian operations. So you've got to be trained up in the basics, no doubt about it. Urban combat is extremely manpower intensive and produces significant attrition of men and materiel among the attackers. Overwhelming firepower can make up for organizational and tactical deficiencies in the short run if one is willing to disregard collateral damage. So yeah, you can just bomb the crap out of places, and you can make up for your tactical and organizational problems in the short run if you don't care about a collateral damage. This is we don't do that. We as Americans don't do that. We care about collateral damage. The sudden requirement to deploy to Chechnya, coupled with the unique supply problems posed by the weather and the urban environment, overwhelmed the already fragile Russian military logistics system. And these are just bullet points, by the way. If this sounds stilted the way I'm reading it, I'm just reading bullet after bullet. A lack of high-quality intelligence made operations more difficult and dangerous on the Russian forces. The geometry and perspectives of urban combat are very different from combat in the open. Urban combat is much more vertically oriented. So in the desert, you do have elevation. You have hills, mountains, whatever. So there is some vertically oriented things that you have to deal with. But in urban combat, every foot can be separated by 10 stories, and so it is a 360-degree environment. Not to mention you get subterranean situations. You have basements, you have cellars, you have underground sewers and pipes and things, tunnels that go from building to building. So it's a 360-degree environment for sure. Fratricide was a serious and continuing problem throughout the campaign in Chechnya, because it was difficult to tell friend from foe.
That's friendly fire.
That's friendly fire. And this is, obviously in our book, I start off, the first chapter is about a fratricide that happens. So obviously we learned this, in the most horrible way. And anybody that's been in hardcore urban combat, and again, I'm not talking about doing an operation with, let's say, one unit against a bad guy in an urban environment. I'm talking about urban combat where you have multiple units all over the place.
Right.
Friendly units in buildings, on roads, and they're mixed in. There's no way you can help it. They're mixed in with enemy, and it becomes very, very challenging. Standard Russian military unit configurations were inappropriate for urban combat. Foregoing peacetime maintenance is a false economy. So there's something to think about.
Foregoing peacetime maintenance.
When you say, you know what, there's nothing going on right now, we'll just kind of slack off a little bit.
Good.
You know what, I don't need to train in the off season.
Right.
I don't need to prepare right now. Guess what? You do. You do need to prepare right now.
Yeah.
It's a lie to think you're going to get away with it. The potential of special forces for urban operations was never realized in Chechnya. Well, we realized it in Ramadi for sure, and how to work it. The nature of cities tends to channel combat operations along narrow lanes of activity. That's just they're called roads. and just like when you're in downtown San Diego in the gas lamp district, guess what? Things are channeled onto long narrow lanes of activity. It's called a road. That's kind of an obvious one. Tactical lessons. Rigorous communication security is essential even against relatively primitive enemies. And this is what the Russians found out, was that the Chechens, many of whom spoke Russian, they would listen to their radio calls, listen to their radio commands. They would actually get on the radios and give false commands. So it was just a nightmare for them. Now in America we have very highly sophisticated encryption systems. So this is really no factor for us. Night fighting was the single most difficult operation in Chechnya for infantry forces. Again, this is something that we are very good at. We being America. We are awesome at fighting at night. We have incredible capability on our night vision. We do it all the time. And actually, that's worth mentioning. The reason that we're good at it is because we do it all the time. We train it all the time. We do it all the time. And we're just used to living in that way. We're used to living in that green world of night vision. Tanks and APCs cannot operate in cities without extensive dismounted infantry support. Now in Ramadi, they absolutely operated, and they operated with a phenomenal success. But they did have an infantry support usually very close by. Although they did push and do incredible operations on their own as well. Forces operating in cities need special equipment not usually found in the Russian TOE, which is basically the table of organization of equipment, so the list of normal things that they had. Lightweight ladders were invaluable for assaulting infantry. And this is on my first deployment to Iraq. We actually we just built little ladders. We built little 2x4 ladders because there's walls all over the place. So we just have ladders, have them hooked onto Humvees. When we need them, we just pop them off,
like
climb
with
over.
Spare wood that was around.
Just spare wood, little 2x4s.
Nice.
Trained snipers were essential, but in short supply. We had plenty of snipers. Obscurants are especially useful when fighting in cities. This is smoke grenades and other ways of blocking vision. But yeah, that's one of those things when I was a kid in the SEAL teams and we would learn like, hey, you got to throw smoke, and then once you throw the smoke, you can run away. And it almost seems like a joke almost. I mean, right? That almost sounds funny when I say that.
Like Batman kind.
Yeah, it's almost like Batman or James Bond, he's got the little smoke button. Yep. It's freaking real. Yeah. It's real. Like you throw that smoke out, you let that smoke start to pour out, and then all of a sudden you can get out of there. Huh. And it's one of those things that it almost seems like a joke when you first hear about it. When you're a kid, you're like, wait, really? That's a real thing?
Really
no, it's a real thing.
Yeah.
Recovering damaged armored vehicles is especially difficult in cities. We absolutely learned that. The insurgents took out dozens of tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles and Humvees, and it was always very difficult for the engineers to get in there and get those things out of there. A failure of small unit leadership, especially at the NCO level, was a primary cause of Russian tactical failures in Grozny. So when you hear me say leadership is the most important thing on the battlefield, that is what I am talking about. Mm-hmm. That is exactly what I am talking about. And it's the same thing in businesses. It's the same thing in teams. And it's the same thing in life. When we talk about leadership, we're not just talking about the overall person in charge. We're talking about leadership at every level.
Yeah.
Both sides employed commercial off-the-shelf technologies for military purposes. Be ready for that. In Ramadi, the enemy absolutely used, little Motorola walkie-talkies. They had Motorola base stations set up. I mean, they were using it. Tactical communications proved very difficult in Grozny. Again, you can't change the laws of physics, and radio waves cannot punch through more than, a couple, 2, 3 buildings. So once you get a couple, 2 or 3 buildings away, you're not going to be able to talk to the other units. Maybe 4 or 5 buildings. And the only way to do it is get on the rooftops. And so, I was almost always on a rooftop because I was, my main role was usually to make communications with the various troops that were out there, Army and my guys. And so I was almost always on a rooftop with a big old antenna sticking off my shoulder. And that's when, when one of the guys needed to talk to me, they knew to go to the rooftop and they'd catch me. The cabs of supply trucks must be armored. No doubt about that. Bunker-busting weapons are invaluable for urban combat. This is something that we used a ton of, was the Carl Gustaf 84 millimeter. Big Thunder. Helicopters are not well suited for urban combat. And there's no doubt about that one. Again, in Ramadi, we found that anytime helicopters came into Ramadi, they received so much small arms fire that they left immediately. It was just too hot for them to go into these situations.
When a helicopter comes in, what does it take to take down a helicopter?
It could take one round, right? It's almost like a human body. You know, there's some sometimes
you hit in the right spot.
You hit in the right spot. You could take it out, but so it's really hard to put like an absolute on that. But you know, generally they can take some punishment, especially the Apaches, which are, you know, pretty well armored, but they're not well armored enough to get in there and do what they would want to do.
Right.
So they end up just taking so many rounds that they couldn't stay.
Yeah. Like if you hit in that rear propeller.
Yeah.
Maybe.
You hit it in the weak spot, there's going to be issues, which I won't talk about.